What I'm going to show you is a technique that I've been using since 1984, and it's a very powerful technique, and it's also been tested and demonstrated scientifically to show what it actually can do. So I call it chakra attunement. It's a way of optimizing your brain waves and your vagus nerve networks for physical, mental, and immune response and deep meditation practice. Now, your vagus nerve is the nerve that runs all the way down your spine and connects with all kinds of other nerves in your body. And usually we are fairly in tune. We have our nervous system working pretty decently, but it's not always that great, not just because we need sleep or anything else, but because we don't have the focus and concentration in our mind to be able to do certain things at an optimal rate. So I have left this complete harmonic intoning CD with Hector, which your people are welcome to copy, and I showed him how you had to open it and what you had to do. It's got Java presentations, so you have to open it up on the first part.imp, because otherwise what's happened with Java is that it's gotten so many security fixes done to it that it gets just darned impossible to open on your computer through the regular means, but you know how to do that. So I left that with Hector. But that's the complete presentation, not the one I'm doing today. Today I'm doing a very short presentation, a short version, and I'm not taking you through all the practice and everything you need to do the major attunement I'm talking about. But I'm showing you some other things that will work nicely. So I received this technique through telepathic guidance 10 years after being consecrated as a bishop, maybe 9 years. It was in 1984. I was an educator, a scholar, a musician, conductor. I conducted symphony orchestras, and I was a jazz musician, and I was very good at that. So I had in my own mind already and in my own concepts the ability to receive this information. And the way I received it was I spent a summer doing prostrations to Christ or Yeshua as the Lama. It was a complex visualization where three things had to be held at the same time, and I was doing that as I was working on my yard in the summertime. So while I was doing that, this all came to me. I had been doing daily meditation since 1969. This is a picture of Mother Jenny. She was my teacher, and that's Bishop Spruitt. And he consecrated her a bishop as an honor, and when she was 96 years old, and that was the first woman he had ever consecrated as a bishop. I don't know if she was the first woman to be consecrated as a bishop. There may have been others. This is a book I wrote about Mother Jenny. It's just very small, but it's called Mother Jenny's Garden, and it's about my experiences with her, and she was an extremely talented psychic and a saint. She was what we call a higher triad psychic. She was not a channeler. She didn't go, nothing took control of her. She received the impressions and she gave them that way, and she was a very advanced person, worked out of her body. When I was a member of the Halcyon Theosophical Community in California, which was established about 1890 or something by Blavatsky's New York group, and they had there in the William Q. Judge Library at Halcyon, they had the chair she used to sit in when she was teaching in New York. And I spent a night, all night long, doing a meditation in the library. And when I when I was awake until about 4 in the morning, and then I fell asleep. And when I woke up, I had these incredible stigmata on both of my hands right here in this area. Now, this picture you see here is a picture one of my students insisted she take because it was 2 weeks after I had received them. They were fading away. But I've made a photograph that shows you what it actually looked like when I received it. It was in that point of my thumb, just right there, so it's very small. So that's enlarged to look like that. And I thought, and it was not a rough, or it was not just a rough thing. It was as though it were a perfect tattoo or something. I thought when I woke up, I thought I had a blood disease or something. I don't know what it was, but one is on each one of these hands. And so I did a lot of research to try to find out what is that a symbol of. And I finally found it in a book by Anne Marie Colton. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of her, but she was a very well-known medium in Los Angeles. And it's the symbol, the theosophical symbol for Hilarion. Now, the interesting thing is that the Halcyon community has as its master Hilarion. Well, who was Hilarion? Well, Hilarion, that's his Greek name, was a close associate of Blavatsky. He was a Greek adept, and she respected him very highly. She mentions him in some of the letters and some of her writings. And he left for Tibet and was never heard of again. And that the last we know is what she said that he's going off to Tibet now. And the interesting thing is that everything I've received has a great deal of Tibetan technique and meditation and everything in it. So I was being guided by Hilarion, and I was guided by him, this consciousness that we call Hilarion, still am being guided by him.
Comments?
Pardon me?
Comment. Can I make a comment?
If you want to interrupt, you can, but it'll all be recorded. I would prefer you would save it for when we stop, if you wouldn't mind, because otherwise it gets to be, you know. But in 1988, I was inspired, or I was kind of, say, compelled by the same teacher to found what we call THG, the Temple of the Holy Grail. And there's a long story about that, about how I traveled for a couple thousand miles with very difficult obstacles in order to carry out the ritual that I was told to do, and which I did. And when I came back, a Tibetan Lama who came to Santa Cruz gave me, who spoke no English, he had a translator, gave me medicine to heal me up, because I had been really beaten up doing this particular work. But it was at that time that I established Temple of the Holy Grail, and it was established as 7 empowerments in a first order. There's also a second order. And these empowerments, there's a whole book you can read about it, but I'm not going to go through all the details here. But I'll simply say this was a process that took some time to be totally revealed and put together. And at that time, I had George Boyer, who was a bishop in England, and the successor and the person who carried on all the lineages and everything from Richard Duke de Palatine, was having dreams about me, and he knew that there was something going on. Now, we didn't have email back then. We had telephones. And so he called me and he said, Louis, what's going on? I've been having these dreams that I need to come and see you, and I need to do some things. And so I said, well, I've been through a very powerful process, and what it was is there was a Templar group in England that would do a ritual on the 8th day, the 8th hour of the 8th day of the 8th month of the 8th decade of the 8th year each century, with what they considered to be the relics of the true chalice or Eucharistic cup of Jesus. Of course, it wasn't. What they had was a terracotta cup that had been held in this group for centuries, and it had been encased in a gold chalice, so it was inside the chalice. And they had another cup. It's now the second cup is now in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. It's called the Chalice of Antioch, and it's from the 4th century. And these things were things that Templars had kept for a long time. And it was time in the century. It was the 8th month, which is August, of the 8th year, which was 1888. And at the 8th hour, to do this ritual, and the ritual was a ritual that would, to protect the planet, the entire planet from evil forces that were trying to overwhelm it. And it was done every century at this time, one time. So there was, in those days, as you know, if you've read Blavatsky, you know that her main mission was to correct the things that all the spiritualists were channeling. Everybody was into mediumship and doing seances and so on. And so a lot of what her work was, and what she saw her work was, as to correct all that information, because there was a lot of incorrect information. And so as a result of this fad that swept Europe of spiritualism and of channeling and table tipping and everything, the ranks of this Templar group had been diminished. There were only a couple of young men and this one old man who was the master, and there was nobody else. So it had diminished down to this very small group. And he needed to do this once a century ritual. So he took these young fellows with him, and they went to England and did the ritual in England, and then went back to his estate where the chalices were kept. However, back in those days, there were all kinds of English magicians and people wanted to get a hold of these cups and use them for magical purposes. And they did, because he moved it to London and came back, they spied on him and they found it. And so they went and robbed it and took it from his house immediately after he had done the ritual. So there was two. There was one that was gold, and it had the terracotta cup in it, and there was one that was silver, that was now known as the Chalice of Antioch. And it was stolen by people who wanted to use it for magical purposes, and then it was stolen again from them by some Middle Eastern antiquities people who melted it down for the gold and just smashed the cup into the ground, into the earth, and also stole the other silver one. And the silver one ended up on the antiquities market about 10 years later and was bought by the Metropolitan Museum, where it now is. I've taken pictures of it myself with it. But of course it was not a chalice used by Jesus. And the other one probably wasn't either. There were many supposed relics that were tossing around in the medieval period. But it was symbolically, it had taken on that egregor, that it was to be used to give this once a year mass, this ritual mass of exorcism to protect the world. Well, I didn't know anything about that. What I was guided to do was to build a chalice and to take it to a very special place and do this ritual, and then come back to my house. And all along the way, big trucks were trying to hit me and run me off the road. All kinds of horrible things were happening. It was very difficult. My health, I was very weak and sick when I got back. But there was in my dreams, and as I was driving, I was hearing this chant saying, Grail Master, Grail Master. And it was a title that was being given to me. But when I got back, this Tibetan Lama came to our town, and he picked me out of a crowd and had me come forward and gave me what they call what do they call them? Something pills that are made of various kinds of herbs and earth and so on. And I got well for that reason, and then I received a lot more information, and I established the beginnings of what would be the Temple of the Holy Grail. And the reason I did so was because what I had done is done the same ritual in the year 1988, on the 8th month, which was August, on the 8th day, which was August 8th, and the 8th hour. And I didn't know what I was doing. I just did it. And I didn't know about this until about a month later. I was reading through some books that I found in a bookstore, and here was the whole story of this thing that had happened before. So anyway, there's a book that we have for THG. It's called Initiation into the Grail Mysteries, that tells that whole story. But anyway, so after this, I started that business, and I had received this information already about harmonic intoning. This is the symbol of THG that was drawn by Scott, a fellow who's now living in the Philippines, who was with me in my last visit. So Bishop Boyer got guidance to travel to the U.S. at his own expense. He and his wife came and transmitted all of Yarker's Pan-Sophic rites and the Fratres Lucas to me as Vicarius Salomonis, and he had received that information in the dream. So I suddenly became the Grand Master of all these warrants and charters that I hadn't studied and didn't know anything about. And so it was not until a few years later. I had never joined the Masons because I didn't care for the Masons, because they did not initiate women, and mostly because a lot of them were, there was a lot of racial prejudice in the Masons and so on, and I didn't care for what they were doing. But when I moved up to Bellingham, Washington, I saw a little notice for the Masonic Lodge there, and since I was, as a professor, I had been professor of history and comparison phenomenology of religions, and especially the Western mystery tradition, and had translated a lot of the Hermetic documents and so on. I was asked by other Masons if I would come in and explain what their rites were, because they, you know, the Masons doing higher degrees don't even know what they mean. They just go through these rituals and they don't know what they're all about. So they wanted me to come and explain that, and I did know a lot about that. But I then looked at their lodge, and there was a lodge there that had people of all different races, and it was very attractive, and I went to it, and I finally decided I would join it. The reason being, I did not have a right to activate any of these warrants and charters until I had been made a Mason, a Master Mason. So I went through the program, became a Master Mason, and there's a lot more to the story. I'm not going to tell you all of it, but basically, one of the things that I didn't know, because I hadn't been taught, was that when I was raised a Master Mason, I had to take an anti-comasonic vow. I would not make a woman a Mason. And I didn't know about that. And I didn't like that when I took it, but I did it. And in the group, there was a man who came over every year from France into Bellingham. And he was always received with grand honors and so on when he came. But the people at Bellingham didn't know that he was one of the administrators of the French Mixed Lodge. And that's one of the 6 lodges of the Grand Lodge, and they have male and female Masons. Now, it's not a co-Masonic lodge. It's a regular Masonic lodge with men and women. So when we got to talking after I had been raised, and I told him about my problems with the anti-co-Masonic vow and everything, and he said, well, we should get to know you better because we're looking for someone to establish the Mixed Lodge in the United States and in California. So anyway, the result of all that, eventually their board came all the way over from France to vet me to Santa Cruz and decided I would be the right person for this, and they went back again, and then they came back another time. They did this all at their own expense, and then they set us up as a Mixed Lodge in France, of the French Mixed Lodge with me as Grand Master, and it was Lodge number 1, Saint Germain. Anyway, things go beyond that, and I won't tell you the whole story of that. But that was when a lot of things were happening, and Boyer had come and transmitted all these things to me, and then I had joined the Masons so that I could validly exercise them. So that guidance has continued to the present time. Now, in 1999, I was asked by Dr. Hiroshi Motoyama to interview for a position of the California Institute for Human Sciences in San Diego. And it's a graduate school. And it has as a motto, it has to prove the existence of the human soul. And this man had invented a machine called the AMI, which is the apparatus for acupuncture meridian identification. It's a measurement of ki or chi, of chakra flow, and of what Tibetans call the winds and channels of the body. What they are is basically major and minor acupuncture meridians that can be measured in terms of how well they are working by something similar to a skin resistance meter, sort of like the people used in that big cult that all the Hollywood people belong to. What is it called? What am I talking about?
Scientology.
Scientology, yeah. Which was, of course, they use it wrongly. They use it to suppress things, and it's very bad. But he invented this because he felt that the health of these different channels could predict the diseases before they started to manifest in a body. So he was funded by the National Endowment for the Arts for several years, and he tested over 20,000 people and was able to see diseases forming long before there were manifestations in the body. So it was very interesting. Now, when I interviewed for the position, which he offered me, he wanted me to get a reading on the AMI machine to see what my health was, which I thought would be fine, so I did that. And so I'm going to show you the reading I got. And then I said, well, let's see what happens when I do my harmonic intoning, what happens to all these winds and channels. So what happened is they were totally maximized and optimized, and only I and the greatest Qigong master in China were able to demonstrate conscious control of Qi flow. And in the Qigong master needed 30 minutes to prepare. I needed 2 minutes. So I'm going to show you my technique, and I'm going to show you the results of it. I decided not to set the position. Okay, here's how it works. All these are acupuncture meridians, all these measurements here. This circle here is healthy. That's how you have to be healthy. And that's measured up on these things here. And there's some other stuff. So there's so many of them, they have to use 2 round graphs to get them all. And you're hooked up with electrodes all over your body to do this. So this is what, in my case, I was healthy, I had a good immune system, I had pretty good chi flow, all that kind of stuff. I was in good shape. So I said, well, instead of taking all these electrodes off, let's give me a couple minutes and I will do my harmonic intoning and see how that affects it. Well, let me just show you all these things. These are, this is called chi flow, and it measures up to a top possible figure, which I was not at. This is your autonomic nervous system, your immune system. These were all shown on different parts of the chart. And then also things like yin-yang balance and things like that. So here's what happened. Everything maxed out. 2 minutes. And I was all the way up here. I had improved much. This pretty good for a 50-year-old man. I was 20 years old, I would have done better. Immune system was maxed. So that's what happened. There's these different categories. So the outer circle is the maximum that's possible. Now I used intoning and what we call mula bandha, which I'm going to also have you do. So after 2 minutes, all these things got done. All this was optimized in my whole system. And I do this every morning. I've always done it every morning. So again, just to look at the contrast, that's before, that's after, in 2 minutes. So I'm going to teach you the technique, but the part of it is really so, it's a little more complicated than we can learn in one session. But on the disc that I gave you is the complete instruction for that. So the first thing I want to show you is a kymatics video. It is a fact that sound, so the vibrations of sound and the harmonics that they produce will form matter. It will create shapes in matter. So here's an old British film showing you how that works. Okay, here it is. So this is two-dimensional. Two-dimensional. Changes, the harmonics change with the pitch, and the forms that you get in matter are different. So instead of watching all of this, this is very long, but you can see that sound affects form. We go a little farther. So you can see it up very close. You see as the sound waves and the harmonics are there. It moves the little particles around to form in these particular harmonic arrangements. So here now is okay, here's a fluid. Here's how it affects a fluid. There's a dark fluid and a light fluid. And it forms three-dimensional shape just on a flat plate. Now let's take a look at the human voice. Now this is two-dimensional, it's not three-dimensional. So your voice, not just the tone of the voice, but the harmonics produce structure in matter. So, sound frequencies and harmonics create structure on a two-dimensional plane or in three-dimensional space. This is what the sound ah, which is what we call the heart chakra, the shape it produces. It's a toroidal shape, like that. So vocal vowels and some consonants, the ones that make sounds, will produce sound frequencies that contain harmonics. So here's some demonstration of that. I'm going to do. And you can see that the harmonics are controlled by the vowels that you pronounce. A, E, I, O, U, etc. If you say a word like joy, you're hitting a lot of harmonics. Joy. And so the thing that produces the harmonics, though, is not the consonants, it's the vowels. So the vowels form a structure in matter and they modulate our brain waves. So in harmonics, there is a sacred geometry that forms. And the ancient Hindus described the sacred geometry of various harmonics. They called them yantras. A yantra is a two-dimensional geometric shape that's used with a mantra in Hindu yoga practice. So you might have this or that. Now here, for example, is Shri Yantra. Shri Yantra is formed on a flat surface when the mantra Om is sounded. Now, how in the world did the ancient yogis know that? I don't know. Maybe it has to do with the fact that they didn't have cell phones and television and social media. But they were very in tune with themselves and their inner worlds. And they actually did that. So here today, if you take a CD of a bunch of Tibetan monks intoning Om, and you sprinkle some lycopodium powder on the top of the thing, you'll get a shape that looks like that. Now, you won't get as perfect as that. That's Sri Mantra. That's a Sri Yantra. But that's the shape, and they had figured that out intuitively before. And so the yantras that they drew, they designed, that they used to help them in their mantras that were associated with the sounds of the mantras.